Alright, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My name is Hakim. I am an Iraqi Marxist. I run a channel named Hakim, as you may expect, where I apply Marxist analysis and critique to current events, as well as discuss theory and other sorts of things. I hope that's a short enough introduction of myself. Sure thing. What originally got me into Marxism is I come from a slightly left-leaning family, but nobody in my family was directly Marxist. But I just generally had like anti-imperialism and so on and so forth, kind of ingrained in me as a child, but loosely. There wasn't actually any theoretical education. Oh boy, how neat! Can you guys hear me now? All right. Just let me know if I cut out so that I can just repeat myself. So yeah, what really got me into Marxism was reading originally. I used to be, especially when I was younger, but I still am, but especially when I was younger, I used to really be into modern history, particularly World War II history. And just through studying it, I realized there's this thing called the Soviet Union, and they were different than the other countries because they followed this thing called Marxism, in particular Marxism and Leninism. And I was intrigued. I was like, what could this be? And then I decided to, go and read the texts, and that kind of, started my path towards being a Marxist. And I've been a Marxist for almost a decade at this point. The person I would idolize the most, I would say, there are two figures. It's Ernesto Guevara, better known as Che, and also Thomas Sankara, who was the leader of Burkina Faso in the early 80s. These two people are the figures I tend to hold closest to my heart, personally. Uh-huh. So yeah, my entire point is, yeah, it's Che Guevara and Thomas Sankara. These are the two people that I admire the most. Mm. Sorry to burst your bubble. There is no such thing as cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism as a concept, it evolved. The idea that there's such a thing as cultural Marxism evolved out of the fascist conspiracy that used to be called Judeo-Bolshevismus, which means Jewish Bolshevism. That somehow morphed into what is now known as the Frankfurt School of Marxism, which basically just applied critical theory to capitalist society. It has nothing to do with direct influence. Yeah, it's essentially a meme. There's no Marxist, or quote unquote cultural Marxist conspiracy to take over the U.S. American universities are not breeding grounds for Marxism. More so, actually, if somebody who's more, let's say, I don't want to use the word close-minded usually, but if somebody goes to university and then comes back with far more progressive beliefs, that may be because they were exposed to many different ideas and particularly many different people from different backgrounds, and that might be the cause of that, not some insidious plot to subvert or the good God-fearing American youth. But yeah, there is no such thing as cultural Marxism per se, and the best example of this was in the debate between Peterson and Zizek, where Zizek asked Peterson, "Where name me a cultural Marxist," and Peterson just essentially was dumbfounded; he could not respond. So yeah, that's my response as well. That's a very interesting question. First of all, there's a primary issue with the question actually because there's an assumption that everybody's paid the same. This is a very common misconception. It's actually very incorrect. If you look at any, oh, I'm sorry, somebody's mic turned on as well. Oh, my bad. Okay, then I'll just start over. The question is very interesting, but it starts off from a misconception that everybody's paid the same under socialism. This is incorrect. Prime example is you can, for example, the Soviet Union. You can take a look and see that there were different pay grades, not only within certain professions, but between professions as well. The highest paid professions in the USSR were professors, the university professors, particularly professors of the sciences, physics, medicine, things like that. While the lowest paid work was unskilled manual labor. So not everybody's working under the same, let's say, payment. There is a payment gradient. Not only this, but people are paid according to their work, even within like unskilled labor, for example. So what this is usually called is a piecemeal system. So it's the more work you put out. For example, to give an example, let's say you're a coal miner. The more coal you extract per weight is the higher the amount of pay you'd end up getting. I think that's a concept that everybody's familiar with. But yeah, so that's what exists in the Soviet Union. As for competition, well, the interesting thing that existed, also I'll use an example in the Soviet Union, was concept of socialist emulation, which is basically rather than two firms competing against each other, the firm that is vastly outdoing the other firm will instead basically the workers from that firm will go to the underperforming firm and essentially teach them what the error is, why they're not producing so much. Maybe it's something in their work process. Maybe they have inefficient management systems or administration systems, on and on. And they would correct these so both firms can reach a higher level together rather than one rising really high at the expense of the other. Yeah, I think that's a good preliminary answer to that question. Thank you for the question. Essentially, the issue with right wing populism in the U.S. is it's a failure of the American left. That's what resulted in that. I don't know if you're the person who asked the question. I don't know if you're familiar with Gramsci's work and particularly the concept of cultural hegemony, but I can give a quick explanation. Essentially, hegemony is the idea where the ruling classes, perceptions, ideas, beliefs, on and on, become the ideas of all society, essentially. That is something that's pervasive in capitalist society because that's how capitalism maintains its social power, essentially. And that's what results in this right wing populism. That's why, for example, when you see working class people and they'll complain that immigrants are taking their jobs. Not really. No, it's the employer, the capitalist, that is deciding to hire and underpay immigrants over native workers. So it isn't the fault of the immigrant per se. It is the fault of the capitalist for seeking lower and lower, wages to give out, so they can extract further profit. So when you look at it through that lens, you see that, for example, the immigrant and the native worker have more in common, as they're tied by labor, than the native worker does with his own native capitalist. Ah, can you guys hear me now? Okay. Yeah. So what I was saying is the native worker, excuse me, yeah, the native worker and the immigrant are tied by labor. They have more in common. Their interests are more as one, let's say, than the native worker has with his own native capitalist. So yeah, and hegemony is the idea that basically causes more anti-labor ideas or more, let's say, less class conscious ideas to be propagated amongst people in capitalist society, and that's what results in the previous example I gave. Um, but yeah, could you please remind me of the question initially? You cut out. Could you please repeat it? Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, essentially, yeah. So it ties into the concepts of hegemony and also the incompetence, let's say, of the American left, to mitigate these factors and spread class consciousness amongst the population. Add on top of that also that liberal organizations or liberals just in general would much rather far right populism than genuine radical leftist movements. Because genuine radical leftist movements undermine the power of capital, while far right populism does not. And historically, you can take a look at this and see that the liberals have always, without fault, sided with the far right, even fascism, over the left. So yeah, it's essentially a failure of the modern American left as well as the Institute of Cultural Hegemony. I'm sorry you cut out right now. Right before you asked the question, you cut out. Uh, it's all right. Yeah, yeah. I got the gist of it. I think I can answer. So, I'm sorry I interrupted you. Thank you very much. I'll take a look at it right now. Um, Yes. So, as for support of the Ba'ath Party, this is kind of a moot point to mention right now, because the Ba'ath Party really does not exist anymore. It exists underground in Iraq, but there's not really, it's not really a political force in Iraq anymore so much. My opinion on it is it's better than whatever's in Iraq now. That's for sure. The Ba'ath Party is far better than the current Iraqi political system and political setup. What are my opinions on the role of Al Bakr and then later Saddam? So, initially, the Ba'ath period can be characterized with very good work. In 73, they nationalized oil in Iraq, for example. And afterwards, they continued nationalizing most industries within Iraq. Paper making, for example, is another one that was in Iraq. Agriculture, everything to do with gas production as well, natural gas production, not only oil, or manufacture and processing, on and on. So it started with the Ba'ath rule started off very well, actually. Iraq's living standard was steadily rising. It became, I believe, the number one, had the highest living standard in the Middle East in the 70s and very early 80s. Combine that with the literacy programs and whatnot, it was very good. Now, the issue that happened is Saddam's rule was not too different from the previous policies. Like, he didn't change much, but the issues were the wars. Of course, it started with the Iran-Iraq War, and then it continued with the Kuwait War, which Americans know as the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And then the unrest that happened, and then there was the civil war between the two different Kurdish factions in the north. This happened around the early 90s, on and on. Essentially, all the problems that arose, came out of primarily the wars that happened, as well as the sanctions that the Americans imposed on Iraq. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Iraq was the most sanctioned country on earth at that point, and I don't think any country has been more sanctioned. Even the DPRK, even Cuba, have had lesser sanctions than Iraq had in the 90s. Yes. So that's essentially the error there. But also there were numerous faults on the Iraqi government at the time. The oppression of the Kurds was another. Certain restrictions on Shiite populations. But it's kind of overblown in the West because they don't understand the dynamics in Iraq so much. So then they hear, oh, the Shiites were oppressed. And then they have an image of like one ethnicity oppressing another ethnicity when it was it was much more complicated than that. 80% of the cadres of the Ba'ath Party were Shiites themselves, so it was very targeted, this oppression. Sure, sure thing, yeah, yeah. I was mentioning that in the West, the oppression that they get of Shiites, they view it from a Western lens. So they view one ethnicity oppressing another ethnicity, and that's that. The reality is much more complex. 80% of the cadres of the Ba'ath Party were Shiites themselves. So this oppression was very targeted. For example, targeted very specific groups or very specific clerics and their followings, for example. And in some cases, it was a bad idea. In a lot of the cases, it was not a bad idea. For example, the oppression of As-Sadr was a prime example because he supported the Dawah Party, and these people carried out assassinations very frequently, bombings in Iraq, on and on, terrorist activity essentially, although on a much smaller scale than modern day Iraq. So yeah, so it's very nuanced, but of course, like you have to take a look at it from all factors, and when you take a look at it like that, the Ba'ath rule was not pretty. It wasn't even particularly that good, but it was better than what is in Iraq right now. Um, oh yeah, so I'll continue from there. Sorry. What I was saying was, the Ba'ath regime or Ba'ath government was not perfect. Not It wasn't even that good really. But it was definitely better than what is in Iraq right now. I think that's the best assessment that I can give of it. All the rest of it is a lot of nuance. And if you really want more details about this, then DM me and I'll send you a couple of books about it if you're interested. Um, yeah, so that's, I believe, the first question. Mm. Thank you. I'm just gonna touch on the thing previously. If I feel that the current government's allowing Iraqis the same quality of life, no, by far, definitely not. They still are talking about, oh, it's after the invasion, blah blah. There's a bit of a hangover. It's absolute nonsense. Electricity goes out half the time. We still don't have decent enough sanitation plants, water sanitation plants. The hospitals are consistently understaffed, not only understaffed, but also the lack of material is severe. Wages can be sometimes up to 7 and 8 months late. So yeah, the Iraqi government currently is it's the definition of a failed state. Essentially thanks to the American invasion. Prior to this, it wasn't the best, but at least it functioned. At least hospitals, right? I would know. I'm a doctor myself. I work in a Baghdad hospital, and seeing the shortages that exist in Iraqi hospitals is absolutely insane. So yeah, that's that question. As for the plan to implement communism, communism isn't some plan to be implemented. Communism is a process. So a better question would be socialism, and even then, socialism is also a process. Primarily, though, it would be if there was a party that managed to conquer state power. Primarily, the fundamental things would be to nationalize state industry, particularly gas and oil, manufacturing, processing, extraction, on and on. That's number one. Number two, it would be to completely restructure both the healthcare sector as well as the academic sectors within Iraq. Number three, it would be to strengthen an internal security apparatus and essentially to control the many armed groups that roam around Iraq without any oversight. And number four would be a literacy program. That would be the immediate things to happen right after a revolution, I would think, and with discussions with the Marxists I've had within Iraq as well, like fellow people that I've discussed with here. Seem to be on the same page. As for the supposed divide between Sunnis and Shiites, this is very overblown. The divide that exists is less religious and more of economic basis, and also has to do with geopolitics. Iran has a very big hand in promoting Shiism in Iraq, so that's the primary issue there, and that would need to be dealt with. But really, the fundamental issue is... Oh, I apologize. Yes. What I was saying was Iran is primarily promoting Shiism in Iraq to further their uh, essentially their soft power in the region, but also in some instances also hard power with direct military movements within Iraq and Iranian military forces within Iraq, on and on. So that would have to be dealt with. But primarily, the supposed divides between Sunni and Shia aren't nearly as, they're very overblown. If you know Iraqis, you're definitely gonna know people who have mixed parents, like one parent is Sunni, another parent is Shiite. They're mixed communities on. And my own parents are, my dad is Sunni, my mom is Shiite, for example. So yeah, it's a more overblown, and it has to do more with education rather than anything else. It would be one of the lesser issues. A much bigger issue would be nationalizing state industry, for example. I'm sorry, you cut out. I didn't hear any of that. Thank you. Yeah, I got it. So my opinion about Abdul Karim Qasim. It's by the way, marhaba habibi. My opinion of him is he's a very misunderstood person. He had a good heart. He was also like the uh, let's say he was the perfect force for Iraq because he was part Kurdish. He had mixed parents. He's lived almost in every part of Iraq. So he was a very eclectic mix of all that was Iraqi, more or less. So he was a very interesting figure. The issue that he primarily had, though, was that he gave too much power to originally the Arab Socialist Union, number one, and then number two to the Communist Party. As ironic as it is, as a Marxist, I'm saying this, but he did give too much power to the Communist Party at the time because they did not have an actual organized, let's say, party platform, or not party platform. What's the word in English? Like a plan for what to do with Iraq, and that resulted in many, uh, let's say, oversights that occurred, primarily because there was very little coordination between central and peripheral organizations within Iraq. So that was the primary issue. At the same time, I think if you read into this, you'll see that a lot of what was going on was not in his hands. Very little of it was, in fact, which resulted in his eventual assassination. But I think genuinely he had a good heart. He was, at the right place at the right time until it wasn't the right time anymore. But yeah, it's a shame that he was assassinated. Sure thing. So my opinion of Saddam is a very, let's say, nuanced one. I'm not in the field where people praise him to the heavens, but I'm also not in the field where people completely demonize him. He did some things right. He did a lot of things that were wrong. But I think it's a good enough assessment to say that Iraq was better under I don't want to say particularly Saddam's leadership, but more so the Ba'ath leadership than the Iraq is now. But yeah, he did. I would say it's 30% good, 70% bad is the heritage of Saddam. I would say. So yeah. Oh, Nasser, Abdul Karim, not Abdul Karim, excuse me, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was actually a very, very inspiring figure. He did a lot of good for Egypt, but he did not do enough. Again, his heart was in the right place. But for example, collectivization and the land reform, particularly the land reform, failed in Egypt. What was supposed to encompass all the fellahin, all the peasants. Sure thing, yeah, yeah. So yeah, he's like I was saying, he's an inspiring figure, but he did not go nearly far enough. And a primary example of this is the land reforms. It was supposed to encompass all the falahin, all the peasants, but it didn't, and it only managed to spread divide only 10% of the land, not the rest of it. So that's one primary failure there. Another failure was the United Arab Republic. They did not work intelligently with that. Instead, they kept two streams of leadership between Syria and Egypt when there should have been one. That's another issue. Third issue was the wars with Israel. That could have been conducted differently, although I won't tarnish the heroism of the Egyptians during that war. And several other issues. He's a good figure. He did quite a bit for Egypt, but he did not nearly go far enough. That's my opinion of him. Yes, I do. I critically support all socialist nations. Yugoslavia, my main issue with it was its market socialism. But even then, every country applies socialism differently. So my personal issues with it aside, they were still a good country. And Tito was a remarkable patriot for his country as well. But essentially, I think generally when it comes to socialist nations as Marxists, it's best to be critically supportive of them rather than just denouncing them for the smallest errors that they may have. For example, in Yugoslavia's case, it would be market socialism and their severe, let's say, lack of cooperation with the rest of the socialist bloc at the time, particularly the Soviet bloc at the time. Yeah. Thank you very much. In Iraq, we speak Arabic, just in case, for people's information. So yeah. But that's fine. That's fine. No, it's no issue. I have not read it actually. So you'll have to forgive me for that. So I can't comment on that. That is actually a very good question. Yes, I would believe that Muslims are, well, on a theological basis, have way more to connect with socialism than capitalism. Primarily on grounds of, for example, the concepts of property within Islam is one. Another is its absolute rejection of riba or usury, its interest. That's another thing. Both these things are absolutely intrinsic to capitalism, but are very antithetical to Islam and its theology. So essentially, Muslims are theologically more suited to be socialists than capitalists, and that's why you don't see like free market people or like libertarians of the American sense. You don't see those in Muslim lands, um, and you see a lot more either just socialist people or I don't know how to exactly word it. More national liberation type people, rather than anybody who's right liberal or a person who's a free marketeer. Could you please repeat the question? You cut out. Hmm. Sure thing. I would say if you really want to start with something, my my go-to recommendation is Frederick Engels' work Principles of Communism. It's a very simple, very short work. It's bullet pointed. It's made as like questions, where there's like question number one, answer question, and then he gives the answer. And it's, I think, a series of like 28 questions. And that's how it's set up. I think that's the best thing to get familiar with, even if you don't want to be a socialist or you don't like socialism or communism. It's just to get to familiarize yourself with socialist ideas. That's the perfect thing to start with. Afterwards, you can look at another work by Engels titled Socialism, Utopian or Scientific. Utopia and Scientific, excuse me. That's another good work to start with, and then build your way up from there. And if you're still interested, I have quite a few book recommendations videos on my channel if you want to look into this further. Of course, yeah. DM me whenever you guys like. There are two. I don't know if this person wants me to tilt the conversation towards the liberal theory of value, but that's not where the conversation is supposed to be headed in the first place. The way that people's by the way, under socialism and communism is two different things. Okay, communism is stateless, capitalist, moneyless society. Stateless society, moneyless society, and classless society. While socialism is as a Marxist-Leninist, it's a state form where basically a motivated group of the proletariat, along with the backing of the masses, conquers state power and then elects to establish socialism through, like I mentioned before, putting the means of production in the hands of the workers, having basically worker organization within workplaces that add towards a plan for an economy, on and on. As for how people are supposed to be paid, with this gradient, it's calculated to the amount of work you do or the level of technical, let's say, what's the word in English? Like how the level of technical expertise that goes into it. I hope that makes sense. I'll give an example. For example, if you I'll give the former example of the coal worker. So if you extract this amount of coal, you get paid this much, but if you extract twice the amount, then you'd get paid twice as much. That's for coal workers. As for that's for just general manual labor. But when it comes to, for example, technical expertise, a doctor obviously will be paid higher than than a cashier, because a doctor had to go to university and study for years upon years, and then they had to specialize and on and on. So their remuneration is equal to the level of effort they had to put in for the job, as well as the level of effort that goes into the job directly. So it just kind of goes back to the former question, which is yes, people are paid. They're paid different amounts according to their labor. The more highly educated you are and the more technical your work gets, then the more you would be paid. And there's a couple more nuances there, but there's something I can recommend as a reading for you if you'd like, so just DM me. Thank you for that question. I think I can answer it. But if I'll need clarification, then I'll ask, because I'm loosely familiar with it. So, is there any compromise between markets and socialism? See, this is a kind of hot button issue, let's say, within Marxism, particularly modern Marxism in the past 20, 30 years. Certain people do believe that market socialism is something that's possible. China is an example of this. They claim that they are a market socialist nation. Many other socialist nations in the past have tried this. Hungary had experimented with this. Yugoslavia was widely known to have functioned under a market socialist economy. My personal opinion is it's I would rather state socialism with a plan, and the limitation of markets as oh, okay, sorry. So I'll just pick up from there. What I was saying is also famously Yugoslavia was known for being for running under a market social system. But as to the let's say possibility of having market socialism, well, this is like I mentioned before, a hot button issue, you can say. There are many that do consider it so, and others that don't. I'm kind of in the middle of the position of that position where I'm not fully against it, but I'm also not 100% for it. I would rather more Soviet socialist form with a direct plan and limitation of markets as much as possible. But if any other, if some country decides to, like, the people elect to have a market socialist economy, then why? Like, my opinion doesn't matter. It's based on the democratic will of the people. Now, as for the system in Norway, this is the thing. Norway is not. I'm sorry. You want me to talk about Norway, right? Sure thing, yeah. Norway does not function under a market socialist economy. Norway functions under a standard social democratic capitalist economy with a certain level of state ownership. Now, granted, this level of state ownership is relatively high, but state ownership does not equal socialism. When we talk about socialism, and this kind of gets to deeper points, it's not only purely economic. There are other factors to it as well, although it's primarily economic. But also, for example, like in Norway, capital reigns supreme. If the government has certain limits that they can place, of course, but it's only it's no different than, for example, in the U.S. The U.S. can also choose to put limits on certain industries and whatnot, on the level of private ownership to public, so on, but they choose not to. In Norway, they choose to. That doesn't change the fact that it's still not a capitalist country. Also, another thing is that we have to take into account that modern capitalism also includes finance capital as well as imperialism. And Norway is a very prime example of a nation of the imperial core, which does exercise imperialism, particularly in Africa, but in many other places as well. Norway is also guilty of the concept of unequal exchange. For example, where essentially more wealth is extracted from third world countries in trade than is given, even though currency-wise it's equal amounts. I made a video about this if you're interested. But yeah, so generally, Norway is not a socialist country. It is a social democratic country with a standard capitalist economy with more state control. But socialism is not when the state does stuff. So it's not exactly accurate to call it socialism. Although, for the Norwegian people, I'm sure they're very comfortable and it's admirable what they've done for their country. But at the same time, we have to realize that social democracy is unsustainable. It exists solely because imperialism exists. So yeah, that's my opinion on that. No worries. As much as for some reason there are a couple of people in the West who are obsessed with these people. They're a meme. They do exist, but mostly in Syria, nowhere else. They're a little bit in Lebanon, but they just generally exist in Syria. Interestingly, a friend of mine, his aunt is a cadre in Syria of the SNP. But yeah, they're just generally a meme. They exist just as part of a fatherland coalition for governance in Syria. That's about it. They hold meetings. They have strange beliefs, pan-Syrian beliefs, and onwards. But really, they're not a genuine political force within the Middle East. If you leave those weird neighborhoods in Syria where they exist, you're not going to find them anywhere else really except for parts of Lebanon. Of course, primarily because number one, it would break up the power of the rural landlords that existed within Egypt. Number one. Number two, it would allow for a reorganization of the agricultural system within Egypt, which is one of the most productive, not only in the Middle East but in the world. But because of mismanagement as a result of this rural landlord system, it's essentially like its potential has not been tapped since arguably since Roman times, or actually more like Middle Ages times. So yeah, it definitely would have been a net positive for Egypt to collectivize their agriculture. Oh, and excuse me. Could I just add on? Could I just add on to that? Yeah. Also, just to like build onto it, so you know where I'm getting with this. The collectivization of agriculture within Egypt would have allowed not only export of agricultural goods, but also to allow a sort of almost primitive accumulation, but not in the capitalist sense, within Egypt to basically bolster the industrialization efforts that would then follow suit if it were like in a socialist plan, let's say. So that's primarily why collectivization is such a good idea. When you're a third world nation with no help, outside help, then the only way for you to have the capital necessary in order to industrialize would be to tap into your own resources. And Egypt's agriculture is definitely an asset in that regard. But yeah, sorry, that's all. I just want to add that on top. Mm. There is no there is no plague and there is no political Islam in Iraq. What exists is a essentially proxy parties for Iranian influence within Iraq, and that's what you're perceiving. If you think a liberal, quasi secular political movement in Iraq is what will help Iraq, you're very much mistaken. Look how that worked out for Lebanon. Um, what we need is what Iraq needs is socialism, definitely. As to how do you get out of there, hey, I'm sure you have family that's out of Iraq by now. Just try to get them to help you. Most Iraqis do at this point. Pan Arabism in the national liberation sense is a net positive for the Arab world, but I also need to state like there's a caveat. When I say Pan Arabism or Arab nationalism, it's not in the European sense. It doesn't mean Arab supremacy and everybody else is reduced. No, what it means is maintaining the integrity of Arab lands and uniting all Arab lands into a single nation. That does not mean that Kurds shouldn't have their own little autonomous area where they're allowed to speak their language and teach in their language and live their life with their own customs and so on. That doesn't mean that Maronite Christians in Lebanon or Copts in Egypt or Berbers in North Africa, on and on, they shouldn't be able to have their own languages and traditions and political structures and autonomy and on and on. Of course, that's included within Pan Arabism. But just generally, uniting the Arab world into one nation and maintaining the integrity of our borders with a socialist plan would be the best thing to occur, not only for the Arab world, but just generally for our Earth entirely. Because the amount of human potential and also the amount of resources within the Arab world are genuinely revolutionary. The potentials for green energy in the Middle East are insane. Solar energy in particular, but also geothermal energy and what's it called in English when you have it when you use the ocean waves and sea waves to in turbines to generate electricity. What is that called in English? Thank you. Yeah, yeah, tidal power. Essentially, you guys understand what I mean. But yeah, that also as well. On and on. So green energy is one example. Another example is agriculture in the Arab world is heavily underproducing. Iraq is an example, but so is Egypt. So is Libya. Also, on and on. That's another example. Another example is the vast amount of resources that are untapped in the Arab world. Another thing is the just general location of the Arab world to facilitate global trade with increased infrastructure, on and on. It's Pan-Arabism has nothing but good to show, so long as, and this is kind of included within Pan-Arabism, there's a respect for the local minorities and their autonomy and languages and traditions and cultures, etc., etc. So yeah, that's my opinion. Trotskyism as actually, I'll be as polite as I can be. Um, I'm more of a Leninist because I disagree with the concept of permanent revolution, firstly, and secondly, a permanent revolution as Trotsky outlined it. I need to put that caveat. And secondly, looking at Trotsky's writings, really, he does not have the theoretical input that people assume. Trotskyism is essentially orthodox Marxism that adopted certain Leninist positions and then peppered with very, very strong anti-Sovietism. That's what it is. And since the Soviet Union does not exist anymore, this is pointless. I'm a Leninist because I'm I apologize. Yeah. So what I was saying was, Trotskyism is essentially orthodox Marxism, which kind of adopted certain things from Leninist positions and is heavily peppered with anti-Sovietism. And since the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, there's no point to these positions. If you were to look at Trotskyism, actually, you'd see that there is no real theoretical difference, so to speak, or at least meaningful theoretical differences. It's usually just political positions on different states and different socialist policies. For example, socialism in one country, and on and on. But yeah, so I'm a Marxist-Leninist primarily because I disagree with Trotsky's positions on, for example, socialism in one country. I disagree with his positions on the setup of a socialist economy. And I also disagree with Trotsky's formulation of permanent revolution. So that's why I'm a Leninist. I believe that anything that two consenting adults do within their bedroom is none of my business. I think that's the end all and beyond. I think that's the position everybody should have. But as long as they're adults and as long as they're consenting, if they want to get married, let them get married. If they want to engage in sexual actions and whatnot, let them do whatever they want. As long as they're adults and they're consenting. After that, it's none of my business. Al-amal ibadah. So yes. And for those who don't speak Arabic, what that translates to is um, labor is worship. Essentially, that's what that translates to. So yeah, essentially, I do believe that. That's actually a very interesting question. My primary issue with centrism or quote unquote centrist positions is because they don't exist. Nobody really is a centrist. If you are opposed to, I don't want to bring in the meme, but you know how, like, in American high schools, they teach the horseshoe theory, where, the center is actually the only unique position, and the farther left you go or farther right you go, the closer those points get. That's absolute nonsense. And not to bring the meme in, but really it is truly a fishhook, where it's just kind of the more right you go, the more you're closer to the center, ironically. Um, the issues with centrism is that, number one, they are not opposed to capitalism, firstly. So as far as they're going to be like, oh yeah, we're not fascists. Well, fascism is just capitalism in decay. So they really go mask off with capitalism and have full state repression and on and fusion of corporate and state power. While liberals liberal or centrists usually don't want to go so mask off essentially, and they're just gonna be like, no, like we still want capitalism, we don't want that heavy state repression, but we just want capitalism still. We still want markets, we still want social inequality, and if you advocate for capitalism, you by virtue advocate for social inequality. It's built into the system, just like cyclical boom and bust cycles are built into the system. So essentially, my issue is you're not taking a concrete position against capitalism, you're just anti-socialist. That's what you end up being as a centrist. That, and also I think many people on both ends of the spectrum can kind of see that you don't hold any real positions. You're just kind of sitting on the fence and just being like, it's I don't even want to say that, like, this is a bit rude almost to say, but it's almost cowardly to just sit in the center and not, the theory is there. Read and see what you like, study up, and then see what position you'll end up in. All right, and I promise you won't stay as a centrist. So yeah, I think that's a concise way of putting it. Oh, Pinochet. Yeah, he was. He's a standard fascist dictator. He absolutely destroyed his country, murdered tens of thousands of people, disappeared tens of thousands of people, many of them have still not been found. He under his leadership, he gave the Chicago boys essentially free reign over the Chilean economy, absolutely destroying it. Child malnutrition rates skyrocketed, social inequality skyrocketed, and essentially the only thing that went well was capital profits, primarily for comprador bourgeoisie. It's not even comprador in this case, local, like national bourgeoisie, but more so like international conglomerates. Those are the only people that won out in that case. So yeah, that's my opinion of Pinochet. Yeah. There is no such thing as Stalinism per se. Actually, not even per se. There is no such thing as Stalinism. The concept or the idea that there is such a thing as Stalinism is mistaken, because whenever you see, like, for example, Maoism or Leninism or so on and so on, these people actually have had theoretical contributions to Marxism that were new. Lenin had new contributions, for example, the concept of the Vanguard Party, and on and on. Mao had New Democracy and People's War, and on and on. Stalin did not. Stalin only built upon Lenin's theory by just explaining it further. That's what the Foundations of Leninism, which is one of the works he has, is an example of. Yeah. So to really say that, what's your opinion of Stalin? There is no such thing as Stalinism, so I can't have an opinion on it. Now, if you mean people who uphold the legacy of Stalin, then those people aren't Stalinists. Those are the vast majority of the third world radical left, and a good chunk of the first world radical left as well. So it's either like every communist you come across, at least in the third world, is a Stalinist, or you realize that there's no such thing as Stalinism. They're just Marxist-Leninists or Maoists or whatever, what have you, and they reflect on the legacy of the Soviet Union and the Soviet administration during Stalin's time, because Stalin was only one man. And they look upon it, and they're critical of it, of course, but they also realize that there were some benefits, there were some correct attitudes or correct things that were done, and there are some things that were incorrect as well. Yeah, so you look at the history of it critically, and then you assess it. As Mao said, Stalin is 70% right and 30% wrong, and I think that's the kind of the general Marxist-Leninist approach to Stalin. I think that's a good way of finishing that question. Sure thing. No, it does not. Cults of personality it's a shame that they occur, but also they're very nuanced. The reason that they happen is incredibly nuanced. By the way, it's just generally if you think you live in a country that doesn't have a cult of personality, take out your wallet and pull out a note and take a look at the face on there. Usually, it's the face of, especially if you're an American, it's the face of the founding fathers. There's a cult of personality there. If you're British, then you take out the note and you see it's a picture of the Queen. There's a cult of personality there. So this is not something exclusive to socialist nations as sometimes it's presented. Many socialist nations have never had a cult of personality, but the ones that have had it, it's a mix of strange political motivation for it, as well as certain cultural attributes. Yeah, but I think it's a net negative and should be something that should be criticized, as well as understood in its proper context. But in the future, should definitely not exist. There is no difference between the way the U.S. is run now or for it to be turned into a corporation outright. Essentially, the way that the United States is run is there's this facade of a political system, which behind it exists all sorts of capital motivations. Lobbying for elections, which, when a person's elected, they essentially extend the favors to the people that lobbied for them, the people who paid for their campaign. That exists. Another example is essentially all American foreign policy is just under the that's just the front of it, but you just pull back the curtain and you see that's the interests of many American corporations at hand. That's why the invasion of Iraq happened. That's why the coup that was supported by the CIA, the coup in Bolivia happened for its lithium reserves. That's why they are so against the DPRK, because the DPRK is sitting on trillions of dollars of rare earth minerals. That's behind the U.S. invasion in Afghanistan, which was to get a hold of primarily its poppy fields, but also many other its rare earth minerals, and primarily minerals used for nuclear production. On and on. So there essentially would be not that much of a difference. That's essentially why capitalism is the way it is. As Marx said, it is capitalist governments. I'm paraphrasing here, but capitalist governments are just a way for the bourgeoisie to kind of carry out their own affairs and discuss the affairs between themselves. That's essentially what that is. So that's my position on that. Not really. I'm not sure how it works in your countries, but the system I'm aware of, and I think this is the system that's in most European countries and most countries just generally, is that your pension is taken out of your own salary. You work when you're young, you work, and let's say you get paid just a hypothetical 10 amount, whatever. Let's just say 10. You get paid, and at the end of the month, you only get 9.5, and that point 0.5 goes into a pension fund that the government keeps. And every month, this amount of money is taken out, and then eventually, when you do retire, the amount of money that you get from the government is taken out of is that pension fund that was from your own salary. So in that sense, they're not exploiting people. And even so, it would never be exploitation because they're not extracting surplus value. So if you're talking about capitalist exploitation, it wouldn't be the case. If you're talking about the just general everyday term of exploitation, who would they be exploiting? They're old people, and if they've worked throughout their lives, then they deserve to be taken care of by society. That's kind of a cornerstone of civilization, to take care of the old and the enfeeble and the young and on and on. So yeah. Unless you want to add on to that question in case I misunderstood you. I'm sorry, you cut out there. I didn't hear what you said. Oh well, then I lost my train of thought on that. Well, essentially, what I was saying is that you guys got everything that I was saying about how wages, your pension is taken out of your salary. That's usually all right. So yeah, so if since that's covered, if we're talking about the sense of capitalist exploitation, no, they're not extracting surplus value, so they're not. There's no exploitation in that regard. But if we're talking about exploitation in the general terms, again, no, it wouldn't be. A cornerstone of civilization is taking care of the old and the young and the enfeebled and on and on. If these old people worked earlier on and when they were young, then they should be taken care of definitely. And I think just generally in most systems they're not taking out more than they gave in. It's usually actually the inverse. They gave in way more than they take out because they die before they ever use up their entire pension fund. And I don't think every country allows the pension fund to go into inheritance. So yeah, that's just generally my position. Um, this is actually a very difficult question. If it's the U.S., yes. Depending what you mean by isolationist. If you mean non-interference, then yes, definitely non-interference. Yes. If by isolationist you mean they continue everything they're doing, but also they restrict flow of people, flow of capital, which wouldn't make sense. Why would they would restrict flow of capital? Um, and the UK, in the U.S.'s case, it makes sense. But yeah, regardless, it depends what you mean by isolationist. All right. All I was gonna say was I complimented the guy on his username. Zoomer Nation's a neat name. But, anyways, the question is the pros and the cons of the Chinese economic system. The pros of it is that it's incredibly productive. It's an efficient economic system. It allows for very quick allocation of resources. You don't have to allow the quote unquote free hand of the market. By the way, no such thing exists in the real sense. But yeah, they're the way that the economy is set up is it's the allocation of resources can be done very efficiently. That's how they can handle crises very well. For example, that's how they handle the Corona crisis incredibly well, like absolutely amazing for the sheer size of China, the amount of movement that happens internally within China, as well as the early point of the outbreak that where it occurred, so that we didn't really have all the information on. So like these are just generally the pros. That's very efficient. It allows for quick allocation of resources, and it also is very well adapted to Chinese circumstances, where areas that need more investment actually do get it, while areas that need less investment can be like controlled to a reasonable degree. Now, the cons of it include this is not really the fault of the system itself, it's just because of the geopolitical circumstance, the amount of pollution that occurs. This isn't China produces everything. That's why they are some of the largest polluters. They don't choose to pollute that much. And in fact, China is one of the few countries that have actually managed to drastically reduce their output and their effect on the environment. Although there's still so much to be done, they're actually showing very large gains compared to the U.S., for example, which has not done anything. But yeah, so their pollution is definitely an issue. Is one. Another issue is because of there is a plan in China, although it's not a conventional plan like in the Soviet system, for example. There is room for certain like corruption, but that kind of exists in all economic systems. But I would say that to a certain extent, the Chinese economic system lends itself to a layer more of corruption, and that's why very severe anti-corruption measures have been taken recently, and also why those are absolutely required. I'm trying to think just generally, because it's a very broad question. I would think as well the system that they have between state-owned enterprise and general private enterprise and cooperative enterprises it's also a positive and a negative. The positive is how dynamic the economic system within China is, but also the negative is it is probably a logistical nightmare to keep in track. And as a result, you'd end up needing very highly technically skilled administrative personnel, and I would assume quite expensive computers to keep it all running. And at the same time, that kind of leads into the corruption thing that I mentioned before. But yeah, I think that's a very, very preliminary, brief assessment. I'm sorry, you cut out. You asked what are my thoughts on dingism? Aha, okay, yeah. Deng Xiaoping, I've very recently changed my opinion on him. Before I was very, you could say I was very dogmatic. I was very, capitalist road or blah blah. But now I've read some of his works and I've realized it's much more nuanced. His position was that China was in severe underdevelopment, and although the Mao era economic policies allowed for an industrial base to form. After that industrial base formed, they needed a different way of developing their economy in their position of global isolation, where nobody wanted to help them. So he took the position of the one that will develop the productive forces the highest, and that was some market reforms and on and on. And I think, looking back at it, that may have been the correct, like hindsight's 2020, right? That probably was the correct position to take, because if they remain just a highly industrialized nation, but with no, output area. I'm sorry. What I was saying was, I believe that it was in hindsight, looking back at it, it was probably the correct position to take to these market reforms in China, because their global isolation, as well as their lack of essentially avenue for output that they would need in order to develop their economy further. So that's kind of my position on Deng Xiaoping. I think, just to preliminary, because I cut out and I don't know how much you guys missed. Primarily, I believe he's a misunderstood figure. That does not mean I uphold Deng Xiaoping right now, but it also means that it's better to get a image of the man from reading his work, and his work is available for free online. So go and read it and then make up your opinion. And you're going to see he's far more nuanced than certain dogmatic Maoists make out to be, although certain criticisms they make are also valid. Now, as for Chairman Gonzalo, he was pretty cool until he got captured. I mean, how stupid do you have to be to fucking... Oh yeah, there's one specific medicine you use, and they know that you use it, and now you just dump the fucking what's it called, the tube of it in the trash can, and then they look through the trash, and hey, they found you. And not only do they find you, but also you have your computer with you that has every single detail that they need to kind of take apart the entire People's War in Peru. I think it's almost right. Like, the positions originally were correct, and the idea that People's War was correct, and that they almost conquered state power and would have won, but because of this small thing, that, and also I believe he called for disarmament when he was in prison. That was also an error that he made. And also there was a very strong cult of personality around him that kind of permeated the movement and almost poisoned the movement, and that's what allowed so many splits to occur later. So he's a very complicated figure, but I think the way he went out was very silly, personally. Yeah. Muqtada Sadr, yeah. Thank you so much. Um, by the way, I hope I'm not tiring you with all the questions. All right, fantastic. So because if it runs on, because I do actually have the rest of the day free, so I could go on answering questions for like the next 3 hours. But so you guys let me know. But anyways, the question was, what do I think about the Iraqi Communist Party and their alliance with Muqtada Sadr? Excuse me. The alliance is already kind of broken apart, so it doesn't matter anymore. I mean, on paper it's still there, but in reality it's no longer there. There's no organization between the two. As to what I think about the Iraqi Communist Party, I do not think there exists a more incompetent Communist Party on earth. Genuinely, I do not think so. I think a small, 8-person Communist Party somewhere in some dingy room in the U.S. is far better than anything the Iraqi Communist Party has ever done in the past 5 decades. They're absolutely trash. Every single position they've held recently in the past 20 years has been, or 30 years, has been absolutely dead wrong. They supported the coalition invasion in Iraq. That was the wrong position to take. They supported the coalition elections in Iraq. That was the wrong position to take. They supported they directly supported the Iraqi government against ISIS. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done that, but I'm saying they shouldn't have united with the government. They should have had they already had their own militias. They could have just went in and coordinated with the Iraqi government, but they did not. They specifically joined the Iraqi government. That's the issue. So basically what that meant is that political leadership of the armed wings of the party left the party and went to the central government, which is a capitalist government. How fucking stupid is that? They've had maybe 4 opportunities to stage revolution in Iraq in the past 25 years, and they've missed every single chance. It's absolutely pathetic. I genuinely, from the depths of my heart, wish you never encounter anybody as incompetent as the Iraqi Communist Party is. Thoughts on Q2? Could you please write that? Uh, uh, Thank you. Yeah, I'll just take a look at it right now. One sec. Oh, oh, you mean the Egyptian political theorist? I think I'm assuming that's what they mean. Qutb. That's what they're trying to say, right? Okay. Yeah. It's a very complex figure. I would say that his commentary on the Quran is actually it's pretty decent. If you haven't taken a look at it, then you should. If you're a Muslim, that is, or even if you're not Muslim, why not? It's definitely interesting, but his political positions were definitely strange. Although I'm very mixed on whether his execution was right or not. It's a very complicated issue, and this is a very long conversation. Maybe DM me and then we can talk about it, because I think this is very uninteresting for the vast majority of people. I mean, I'm not averse to it particularly, but I'm not also 100% for it, just because of the way I've seen him interact with others. He seems to be he has a very how can I word this? He doesn't want to have a conversation. It looks like he just wants to be like, haha, look, I'm right, which most of the time, I mean, that's debatable. But yeah, my personal opinions of him are, if he's doing good work in the American left and if he's actually bringing people to leftism, why not? I don't mind. But my personal disagreements with his political positions it's like half and half. I can't say, half of the time I can't say, because he's very unclear about what his political positions are. And the other half, from the few things I can glean from the very few clips that I've seen of him, it seems to be he's either maybe a market socialist of some kind, or maybe an anarchist, maybe ANCOM type. I can't really tell exactly. He hasn't. Maybe he's been clear with it. I just haven't seen it. But if he is those things, then I have the usual Marxist disagreements with anarchist thought and anarchist political positions. But I don't mean it in any disrespectful way or anything. It's a comradely disagreement, like with any other leftist there is out there. But that's just generally my opinion. Thank you for the question, by the way. Hi. So, my look, socialism proved its efficacy long before China and Vietnam. But that aside, um, I think that the geopolitical shift has been occurring already for a couple of years now, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative. Many countries, particularly in Africa, but not only, many Middle Eastern countries too, have been pivoting towards China. And I think this is just a sign of the times because we're in the declining Roman Empire that is the U.S. Won't last that much longer, and it's very obvious that the new dynamic world power that is like coming into its full form is China. Now, of course, nothing is certain and all that, but it's very obvious that the U.S. is declining power and China is a rising one. So I think this is just essentially a sign of the times. If it means there will be more socialist nations, then fantastic. If it just means there will be more national liberation type governments, then of course I don't mind that either. I think just generally when it comes to world trade and foreign policy, China has a better record than the U.S. So that may be the reason for the geopolitical shift. But yes, it's happening already. It's not gonna happen. It's already been happening since 2012 probably. Yeah. My thoughts on the Iran-Iraq war. This is a convoluted topic because there's very very little good writing on this in English. But essentially, just my thoughts are the thoughts of what actually happened. After the Iranian revolution, quote unquote revolution, basically the Iraqi government wanted to establish good ties with Iran, but Iran refused. Essentially, they want to export their quote unquote Islamic revolution, which was neither Islamic nor a revolution. They want to export that to Iraq, and that immediately set them on bad terms. Not only that, but Iran commit numerous breaches on Iraqi sovereignty. Number one, by funding and supporting armed groups within Iraq, as well as political parties within Iraq. That was number one. But number two, and much more seriously, they commit many military attacks on the frontier of the eastern border of Iraq. Numerous air raids or air I don't understand. I don't know the English term isn't coming to me, but yeah, air raids I believe is the correct word. Air raids and skirmishes on the border that occurred, and Iraq at the time sent maybe 200 notes to the UN for this to cease, and Iran did not cease, and hence the war commenced. And originally it was completed in 1981, where basically Iraq invaded Iran and basically as a show of force, like, we can take this war to the end, so stop what you're doing. And then the retreat occurred, and then the Iranian counteroffensive happened, so the understanding that there would be a ceasefire was not essentially understood. And then that dragged the war on for a couple more years until 87, when basically Iraqi offensives along the entire front basically start pushing into Iran, and then finally the UN ceasefire directive came into force. But essentially, my opinion is that it was a horrible war, it shouldn't have happened, and the only reason it actually happened was because Iran did not respect the sovereignty of Iraq at the time. But yeah, I believe few books written in English do discuss this. Oh man, I don't remember the title now, but there's a French author. His name is French at least, but he writes in English, and he wrote a book on the Iran-Iraq War. If you guys are curious, DM me and I'll send it to you. I'll send you the title. But yeah, that's my opinion on that. I'm neither an atheist nor an anti-theist. I'm actually a very devout Muslim. There is potential for revolution. I would rather this revolution be a particular, socialist one of the Leninist persuasion, but if it has to be a Ba'athist one, it's better than what we have now. And yes, there has been potential for revolution in Iraq for the past 18, 20 years. It just requires a good enough organization. If only the Iraqi Communist Party got its stuff together, essentially. But if it's Ba'athist, then sure. If it has to be a Ba'athist revolution, why not? They're far better than what we have now. Thank you. This question is functioning two misconceptions or presuppositions that need to be cleared up. The first one, the idea of totalitarianism or totalitarian communism. There's no such thing as totalitarianism. This is a nonsense term. The vast majority of capitalist countries are totalitarian, just in different senses. If somebody is fired from their job and then kicked out on the street, or somebody basically has the choice to either work a horrible job that heavily overworks them and doesn't pay them, or be homeless and starve, this is totalitarianism in practice as well. It's just not taught in the World War II nations subsection in American history classes, so people don't consider it totalitarianism. So that's it's absolutely nonsense. That's number one. Number two, the idea that first of all, there's a difference between communism and socialism. Again, so I believe the correct term is socialism that you're looking for. And second of all, the idea that there would be no creativity, blah blah blah. I'll let's just take a deeper look into that. Only around 2 or 3% of the world population has higher education, like university certified higher education. Think about that for a second. Even if the number was higher, even if it was fucking 13 or 15%, I may have gone to the percentage wrong. Maybe it's like 5%, but the last time I remember it was something like 3 or 4%. Regardless, even if it was like 10 or 15%, that doesn't matter. The vast majority of humanity does not have any higher education qualification of any kind. Nothing. Do you realize how much human creativity has been locked up? How many people toil away on fields, which, by the way, vast majority of agriculture in the third world is still done by hand, despite the fact that we've had the technology to mechanize this agriculture for a century at this point. So many people still work jobs like long, dead. Even in modern capitalist countries, people will go to work at 8 and work a long, deaded job until like 5 or 6 in the evening, and then come home and have literally nothing. Their brain is fried. They have nothing to, the amount of human creativity that has been locked up by capitalism is essentially insurmountable. And what socialism intends to do is, number one, is first of all, and this is a socialist kind of what's the point? Like a bullet point, something that all socialists wanted, and this is what socialists fought for historically and still fight for, is reductions of the working day. Because not only has research shown that if you reduce the working day, the amount of productivity actually gets higher. Not only this, but work just generally, particularly in Western economies, the amount of productivity increases year by year as well. So primarily what I'm saying is, number one, what socialists want to do is reduce the working day, which they did. For example, in the Soviet Union, people worked, I believe, 7 hours, and they experimented with 6-hour days as well, which is interesting. So not only this, but also what socialists want to do is to grant free, extensive, and high-quality education to all people in society. Not a select few, not a bunch of people that come from rich families, not a few, token scholarships. Everybody in society. Everybody, every single person, to have the ability to go and get a full, extensive education. No loans to be taken out, no barriers to entry to education that exist. Even in, let's say, social democratic nations of Europe, many people, even though in many European countries it's still free education, there are social barriers to enter that education, usually lower socioeconomic status, which forces people to have to go and work at an earlier age and not be able to pursue education even if they want to, on and on. What socialism tends to do is to educate everybody, so then not only is the cultural level, but also the intellectual level of everybody in society to be raised, to raise this cultural and intellectual level, and also to reduce the amount of time that is spent in petty labor so that human creativity can actually be unlocked. So people can give their time to human ingenuity and human creativity and human development, either if it comes in the forms of sciences or if it comes in the forms of the arts, writing and music and so on and so on. So socialism is not the barrier to human creativity and agency. Capitalism is, and it's the one that has been historically. I think that's I think that's a good way of summarizing that point, essentially. But if you have a follow-up, feel free to ask. I missed just small parts of that question, but I think I can glean what you meant. Otherwise, if you could, please just send it to me via DM so I can. Yes. Yes, of course it's first of all, the term condemnable regimes. The question was, is it justifiable to support or lend advocacy to otherwise condemnable regimes that oppose American imperialism, for example, China, Russia, Iran? First of all, you have to deal with each nation individually. Not every country is the same. Second of all, to claim that they need to be condemned is you're functioning on you're already coming from like a fallacious standpoint. You've poisoned the well by being like, oh yeah, these people should be condemned, but should we still support them nonetheless? Why should you if you're gonna take that perspective, every country on earth has something to be condemned about. All right, the first and foremost of those being the United States. But generally, China, for example, Iran being direct. I'll give an example of Iran, for example. Iran is a soft imperialist power within the Middle East. They commit imperialism within Iraq, particularly in the agricultural sector in Iraq, but also in other senses. So it is, not a progressive power in the usual sense of the term, but they are also at the let's say sharp end of American imperialism and American basically bullying, let's say, with sanctions and whatnot. And as a result of this, they deserve to be defended, and you should lend advocacy by virtue of this, because the people who suffer under these, it's the regular everyday people, just people like you or I, that suffer underneath these sanctions and this diplomatic, limitations placed on Iran, so on and so on. Same goes for the DPRK, same goes for China, and on and on. Now, the point of most, and this is something that you probably heard this term a lot, Marxists, when they talk about, let's say, the DPRK or China or even Iran, they'll say critical support. The reason we even preface this as with critical is because you need to be critical about the support you give. We know that Iran is not a progressive power in the common sense of the term. It's not a progressive power just in general. But at the same time, you have to realize that just because you may disagree with the things they do, or there may be things that they do that are unpalatable just generally, you also need to realize that they don't deserve to be sanctioned to the Stone Age or bombed to the Stone Age, like they did with Iraq, like they did with Cambodia, on and on, right? So that's kind of the position we're coming from. Also, by the way, so because a lot of people talk about advocacy or support, this support has to take an actual material basis. It can't be just like, oh, you put in your Twitter bio, oh, I support Iran or whatever. This should function in the form of maybe education. That's the simplest way, where you educate people about these countries. Be like, hey, Iran is not actually as bad as you think. They don't have anything against us everyday Americans. They just want to live their own life, right? They just don't want to be messed with by they don't want the American bombs falling on them, essentially. When you talk to people like this, that's a form of material support. And the other forms of material support are to Iranian agencies or organizations that help Iranians directly. So either material, like money that you send, or other forms, right? The same goes for DPRK, same goes for China, on and on. Essentially, I think primarily the best thing that people can do in the West is usually information. Just tell people about these things. Tell them that, hey, this boogeyman image you have of the DPRK isn't actually real. They don't actually believe unicorns exist, and that their leader has drinks 8 bottles of Hennessy a day and he doesn't get drunk or God knows what. Yes? Oh, wow. So should I start the question over again? Oh, okay. All right. Essentially, my point is this. Just generally, we have critical support, right? Now, if even if a nation does certain things that may not be the best, if they are at the receiving end of imperialism, they do deserve a certain level of critical support. Now, when we talk about support, it has to have a material basis. You can't just put it in your Twitter bio. It has to be something like either information, like you inform people about these nations, say, hey, they're not the boogeyman they're painted out to be in American media. They're actually, just regular people living in those countries. They don't want anything to do, they don't want to harm Americans. They just want to live their life and be able to develop their economy and infrastructure and society without American bombs falling on them or American diplomatic restrictions kind of strangling them. You like in either that or direct aid to certain agencies, organizations that help these countries with these sort of things. That's just generally what it is. So yes, it is justifiable to lend advocacy to these governments. First of all, yeah, that's it. That's my point. I don't want to run on too much on this, but yeah. All right, yeah. For my madhab, I am a Hanafi Sunni. Practically, this is unsurprising for an Iraqi Sunni. Vast majority of us are Hanafis. So that's it. The second point, sorry to say, but almost all of what you said was incorrect. Islam is not a hierarchical religion. In fact, it's very anti-hierarchical. Now, if there is an Islamic state, then yes, a caliph would be at the top. But you realize that first of all, there is no Islamic state currently, and there hasn't been one since the Ottomans. Number one. Number two, the caliph has to be elected. It's an elected position. That's why you mentioned the shura. A shura is basically a council. It's oh, my bad, my bad. Excuse me. Yeah, I'll start over then. But yeah, Islam is not a hierarchical religion. It's in fact the opposite. It's very anti-hierarchy. When you mentioned the things about the Caliph and the Shura Council and the ulama, that's actually incorrect. First of all, in an Islamic state, then yes, there is a Caliph at the top. But first of all, there is no Islamic state, and there hasn't been one for a century since the Ottomans. That's point number one. Point number two, the Caliph is an elected position. Traditionally, when we see when you look at the Ottomans, yeah, it was a hereditary position, but that was an incorrect way of going about it. The Rashidun were elected caliphs. Aside from Abu Bakr, the rest were elected caliphs. Number two, you mentioned the concept of the shura. Shura is basically it's a council. It's a council of people that get together. Now the shura can get together. This council can be as large as a nation. It doesn't have to be only scholars. It doesn't only have to be ulama. It can be essential. What I'm trying to say is you can have a democratic shura that elects a leader, and it can still work within the confines of what is traditionally considered to be an Islamic state, if you want an Islamic state in the first place. So yeah, that's point number one. Number two, just to bolster this point, Islam is not hierarchical like, for example, Judaism, where you have a rabbinic council, or Christianity, where you have a church with a pope or a patriarch or a pontiff, on and on. In Islam, there is no difference between everyday believers. When people mention imams first of all are chosen leaders. They don't just kind of elect themselves. And number two, the vast majority of imams just lead prayers in like a mosque or something. To achieve political power, these people not only need to have a democratic consensus in the form of bay'ah, but also they need to have sorry, did I cut out again? Yeah. But also they need to have a certain consensus from their community, on and on. So yeah, just bold points. Islam is not hierarchical, and number two, if you want to have a regular democratic society, this can fit within the basically within traditional Islamic political thought. You can have a democratic election of leaders. So yeah, that's my point. That's a very good question. First of all, education. That's primarily what you need to do. Many of these people just don't know better. Now, by the way, if there is something to genuinely criticize, you should criticize it. Don't shy away from criticism. Criticism is what pushed socialism forward, and what continues to push socialism forward. So, yeah, if there's something genuine to criticize it. Don't be blind defenders. There's no room for dogmatism within Marxism. So that's the thing. But so educate them if they don't know any better, because many of them do not know any better. But if they do know better and they're still very harsh on their positions, you can, for the most part, you can ignore them. Really. Sorry. Oh no, no, yeah. For the most part, you can essentially ignore them. These people have existed since the beginning of the left, and they've never really contributed to leftist thought. In reality, the vast majority of these people, um, Iroquois Pliskin, could you, yeah. It's because Iroquois Pliskin is very loud right now, and I can't actually talk over him right now. Nah, I could hear you for the past minute. So yeah, sorry, I believe I cut out, so I'm just gonna summarize the two. Yeah, it's much better, thank you. So yeah, I cut out, I think. So I'm just gonna summarize the 2 points that I said. Number one, most of them don't know any better, so do discuss with them, show them evidence, and basically correct their any point that they're incorrect on. Now, if there's some genuine point of criticism, then you should join them in that criticism and build upon it. There's no room for dogmatism within Marxism. That's my first point. My second point is, if they still won't change their ways, then you can just ignore them. The vast majority of these people have never contributed anything to socialist thought or revolution. They just kind of exist on barnacles on the underbelly that is the socialist whale, let's say. But yeah, so that's my point on that. Yeah, yeah. Mm. Oh, it's all right. So we can go to the next question. I don't like to use the term middle class because it's actually quite meaningless. If you ask the vast majority of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck, they consider themselves middle class. Yeah, they don't want to build a middle class society. They want to build a moderately prosperous. That's how they term it. But essentially, what they mean is eliminate, by their own terms, poverty as they consider it within China. I believe that the vast majority of this has already been achieved. I'm sorry? Did I cut out? I'm sorry, did I cut out? Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. The what China what I was saying was China's goal in their terms is to build a moderately prosperous society. That's how they termed it, not a middle class one. But if I think they'll accomplish this, I think it's already been accomplished just generally. I think the 2020 deadline is just for posterity's sake. Um, the amount the vast majority of the poverty reduction in China has already occurred, and now it's maybe down to like 1% or 2 or 3, like such a small amount to be eliminated that I'm sure that if they don't get it done by the end of the year, they're gonna definitely get done by 2025. So I think they will definitely achieve it within the next couple of years, if not by the end of this year. I'm sorry, you cut out. You before you started the question. Hmm. As for comparisons, I would need to look at the data. I can't do this off my head right now. I think the East German economy was quite larger than the Cuban one, though, because East Germany was much more focused on industrial production, while Cuba had a bigger agricultural sector. But I still, don't quote me on that. I would need to check that, so I can't comment on that. But what do I think about East Germany? East Germany was actually a very interesting experiment within socialism. Particularly because it was a more developed starting position that it had. It still wasn't ideal, but it still is better than what Cuba started off with, or the Soviet Union started off with, or China started off with. But yeah, I know a lot of people who consider their ideal socialism, like socialist example, to be the GDR in the previous century. I'm kind of on the fence about that. I partly agree, partly disagree. Their social functions were absolutely fantastic, particularly their support for women. And their economic policies also were very interesting as well. I do uphold the example if that's what you're asking. And there are many good books on it that I can recommend to you. So just DM me if you want to see that. Yes, you cut out partially, but essentially the question is about the abolishment of the commodity form and what I consider of it, I believe. So yeah, yes, the abolishment of the commodity form is an absolute necessity for the development, for the mature development of socialism. Yes. Now, the thing is that what we would like and what is possible are two different things. As a Marxist-Leninist, I'm telling you, there's nothing more that Marxist-Leninists want other than abolishment of the commodity form. But you have to look at you have to be pragmatic about these things. I'll give the example of the Soviet Union, because many people are like, oh, the Soviet Union was capitalist because the commodity form still existed. You have to actually, there's so much more nuance that you're missing. And this is like, I'll take the Soviet Union as an example. So, let's say you want to abolish the commodity form within the Soviet Union. But then you realize, number one, you have cooperative production, agricultural cooperative production, which means a certain level of market exists. Like a limited market, but a market exists. Number one. Number two, you are globally isolated, and in order to get hard currency, in order to get maybe materials and what, because you're not fully self-sufficient, you need certain materials from elsewhere. You need to participate in global trade, and in order to participate in global trade, you need to produce things in order to be sold globally, like on the global market. All right. That's the only way of getting hard currency that you can then use to purchase other necessities that you may not produce within your own country. Like, for example, let's say lithium, if there's no reserve of lithium. Soviet Union had lithium reserves, but I'm just giving a random example. So, you have these two things. You have an internal market within the cooperatives where there exists essentially production for sale within the cooperatives. So that means there is a commodity form being reproduced on the daily within that formation, and also the requirement for trade abroad. So these are two big issues, and you need these two things, the first of which, the cooperatives, can be eliminated, and they were slowly being eliminated. If you look at Soviet statistics, you'll see that the percentage of cooperatives, kolkhozy, are reducing, while the sovkhozy, the industrial farms, are increasing. So that level, that form of that originating point of the commodity form would have been eliminated. So that's one. But the second one, which is external trade, that would require a global revolution. So that's already an issue. Now, add on top of the fact the many internal intricacies of developing socialism without modern computing to arrange a plan, and you might this might result in certain things requiring efficiency with production for sale. Nowadays this won't be such a big issue, but back in Soviet times they didn't have the modern computers that we had to have such a refined plan, so they had to resort to certain other things, right? My entire point is this: yes, we need to abolish the commodity form. It is the ideal. Everybody wants it. But also we need to be pragmatic and realize that it's not like, there's a commodity form button that we press and it turns off. We need to eliminate the originating points for the commodity form. And those cannot always be eliminated, particularly in globally isolated, prematurely developed, or highly underdeveloped economies. So that's kind of the end all and be all of that question, and we can discuss this more in the DMs if you're interested. I believe the thing that you were mentioning was the Uyghur population or the Uyghur, as it depends on how you want to pronounce it. Yeah. The My personal position of that is the actually the official Chinese position, as the position that the dozens of Muslim nations that have visited, like delegates and officials that have visited them, and come back with the same opinion, is that there is a very strong current of, by the way, very interestingly, American supported terrorism within Xinjiang, within that area of China, and it's been quite deadly for a few decades. And the Chinese have been very patient with these attacks, and have slowly they've committed to reducing them through education and vocational training and whatnot. But like at this point, it's getting to a ridiculous degree where almost on the weekly, or practically weekly, some dumbass rams their fucking truck into a market and blows it up, killing like 20 people. So essentially, what they realize is the primary issues of that what's attracting young people, usually young unemployed people, towards terrorism is incorrect ideology, secondarily, but primarily their low level of development, because it's they don't have jobs, maybe they have very low pay, they're uneducated, on and on. So what China does is the intelligent thing. What the Americans do is they bomb Muslims to the ground, essentially. What the Chinese did, it was to establish basically these vocational training schools where they teach them language, they teach them skills, marketable skills that they can actually go and work with, and also correct these misconceptions, which they do along with Muslim scholars. They don't just do this on their own, right? Talking about the terrorism that's committed by these groups, Islamic. I hesitate to call them Islamic. There's nothing Islamic about them, but they claim to be Islamic. These scholars will sit down with these people and talk to them and actually educate them as to the errors of that, of the Al Qaeda, ISIS bullshit that's happening. And the vast majority, in fact all, I haven't seen any dissenting voice from Muslim officials that have visited, have come back with the same opinions, because in many of our countries we deal with the same issue. There's underdevelopment and no employment, and young people get pulled aside into these terrorist groups and do stupid things, hurting people. So that's my opinion on what's happening. Now, as to the Western portrayal of it, the United States has killed 1.5 million Muslims in Iraq. It's killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Afghanistan and worldwide. They've sanctioned Muslim countries. They discriminate against Muslims at home. They do not care about Muslims. All of a sudden, when it comes to China, they're the human rights bearers and all that. It's bullshit. It's all nonsense, right? The United States does not it does not care whatsoever. This is only a geopolitical, jockeying game, where they want to basically paint China in a bad light, despite the fact that what the Chinese are doing it's actually a net benefit to the Muslims over there. That's number one. Number two, by the way, for those people like, oh, but no, there's actually Muslim. If there really was oppression of Muslims, then how come there's a handful of other ethnicities that are traditionally Muslim, the Hui are primary amongst them, but many others, and they have no issue. Not only this, but in Xinjiang, there are mosques still being constructed. Each year, the amount of mosques actually increases, doesn't decrease, on and on. So it's the Western portrayal is basically geopolitical nonsense in order to paint China in a bad light and, villainize China because it's becoming a new economic power and it's pulling away from the power of the EU and the US. That's why. Other than that, what the Chinese are doing, according to the information that I have and what I've seen from the delegations that have visited those areas, by the way, the Iraqi delegation was one of them, is that what they're doing is actually good and, in fact, would have been pretty decent to come it even in Iraq, for example. So that's my opinion on that. Yes, Gaddafi. To say, oh, the best African leader. I mean, I don't think one person can take that position. I think Thomas Sankara is up there. Nasser is up there. Mandela is up there. Kwame Nkrumah is up there. There's so many people who are also in this position. So you can't just say there's one. But he really was a fantastic figure. As for his the third his Jamahiriya thought, the Green Book and whatnot, it's actually not bad. I do recommend, if you guys have the time, it's a short pamphlet. Take it, go read it. It's free online. It's not bad. Genuinely, it's not bad. If socialism applied to Arab like material conditions, it needs a little bit of work, but more or less it's actually very good, and it shows because Libya was the country with the highest living standard in Africa. The level of satisfaction amongst the Libyan population was high. Libyans that I've met and spoken with have all like when you discuss with them, they talk about it in very like a positive sense and all that shit. Doesn't mean that of course no country's perfect, but you know what I mean. Like generally, it was a very good nation, and the administration of the time was did a very good job running Libya. So yeah, that's my answer to that. Uh, did you guys catch that? No, I'm almost yeah. The administration at the time did a very good job, and I think yeah, that's just it. That's the done. The question is. This is a very loaded question. I love it, but I'll take it apart. I do support the Soviet Union. I do support China back then, and of course critically, and I do support China critically now. As for the nonsense of oh yes, there's brutal censorship. There's brutal censorship in the United States. Okay, the protests are still ongoing, except American media doesn't report on it. European media doesn't report on it either. The amount of murders that have occurred at the hands of the U.S. police, just unsanctioned, just little execution in the streets, is the sort of shit I see in Iraq. That's not censorship of people. Activists who just want to advocate for people's life, for people's dignity, asking, hey, maybe police shouldn't shoot unarmed African Americans in the street. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll repeat. But yeah, the protests in the United States are the perfect example of this, where there, if you really want to look at the brutal suppression, you need to look at the United States. You can't point fingers at China. What China is doing is child's play compared to the United States. The United States they're the ones who have black sites with political prisoners that have never been tried and aren't even charged. Okay, Guantanamo is filled with people who have never even gotten a charge. Many people had to leave the United States. Asata Shakur is a perfect example. People had to leave the United States on trumped-up charges. By the way, she didn't. The crime she was accused of, she did not commit, and she was forced to flee to Cuba. Fred Hampton was shot by FBI agent in his sleep. No trial, no jury, no nothing. Right? This is like it's silliness to play this game. Right? My entire point is, and as for censorship, by the way, like internet censorship, you have to realize that the American propaganda machine, which by the way, I don't. If you disagree that exists, well then you should read Inventing Realities by Michael Parenti or Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. It's practically the same book. But yeah, if you disagree that the propaganda machine in the U.S. Doesn't exist, it does, and it works overtime, especially against these nations. And as a result, the censorship that exists within China is actually very much required to curb these influences. Now, if the United States wasn't so hell bent on basically destabilizing other countries with information warfare, amongst other things, then maybe they wouldn't have to have the censorship. The position you're starting from is incorrect. You shouldn't look at the censor. You should look at why the censorship exists in the first place, right? The best example of this is the other day. I believe it was Guyana, I think, which publicly denied a request from the CIA to place radio towers in order to send propaganda messages into Venezuela. The other day, and they published it. Right? Like these sort of things happen, and that's why you need censorship of a certain extent. I would rather there be no censorship. I don't want there to be censorship, but you also have to be pragmatic about these things. And by the way, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so these sort of things happen, and you have to be pragmatic about these things, right? Like I said, I don't want censorship. I do not want censorship to exist. But you have to also realize that at a certain point, national interests and national security matter more than somebody being able to, I don't know, access the New York Times, which, by the way, why would you even want to? Um, you know? And again, like the final point is, if you truly believe that, my just general point is, go and read Manufacturing Consent, for example, and then reassess that position on censorship. And as for, by the way, Tiananmen Square, everything you know about Tiananmen Square is wrong. First of all, when people are like, "Oh, the Chinese don't know about it," they do know about it. They just go by a different name. They don't call it Tiananmen Square event. They call it the date that occurred, and then they say event. I don't remember the exact date, but that's what. So if you look that up, results do come up. That's number one. Number two, the famous picture of the tanks and the tank man and all that. First of all, those tanks were leaving the square, not going to it. So the guy was blocking detachments from leaving the square. So that also. And there's so much information to it. Just go on Google and write everything you know about Tiananmen Square is wrong, and you'll see what I mean. It's a heavily propagandized event, which is rich, coming from the United States, where so many things are, so many political things are covered up, particularly these executions that occur randomly on the street of African American men who have done no wrong. So yeah, that's just kind of the end all and be all of that. DM me if you want to, like, if you want actual the resources that I mentioned, because this answer was a bit more scattered, because the person I don't think was asking in good faith. But anyways, so yeah, we can go on to the next question. Sure thing. I have very little to plug. I have my channel, which is just Hakim, so look it up. It's usually like the second result. The first result is some singer. So yeah. But I think that's about it. My only thing to say is go and go and read theory. If you have anything, if you find anything wrong with what I say, realize that I'm always open to it being corrected, and know that I try to come with most of my positions from like an informed basis, and So yeah, just read theory. That's my entire point. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming here and listening to me ramble for 2 hours. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you so much.